So welcome everybody. Good evening. It's a pleasure to be learning with you all again here as part of Drisha's Falls Ma'am. This is, I believe, the last session of Between Heaven and Earth, case studies of the tension between halakha and morality with Rabbi Nati Helfgot. Before we start, as you come into the Zoom room, I will invite you to become a panelist. You should accept that invitation. It just means that you come into the main Zoom room. You can choose to put on your camera if you wish. And when Rabbi Helfgot invites questions or comments, you'll be able to unmute to ask yourself. When you're not speaking, we just ask that you keep yourself on mute. It minimizes the background noise so we can all hear each other. Your questions and comments are always welcome in the chat if you're joining us on Zoom, and in the Facebook comments if you are joining us on Facebook Live. I will share a link to the source sheet for those who want to follow along at home, and also I will be sharing the sources on the screen. With that, over to Rabbi Helfgot.
Okay, thank you so much. And it's been wonderful learning with everybody. Tonight, as was mentioned, tonight is the last class. Next week is Hanukkah. I wish everybody a wonderful Hanukkah. I will be taking my youngest son to a Maccabees concert, so I wouldn't be able to teach anyway. And I hope you're able, even during these very trying times, it's important to at least take a little bit of time for yourself and your family, a little bit of some joy in these very challenging, anxious, depressing, and all those elements that we all think about. So tonight the last class tonight, we're going to be doing a very sensitive topic, like all of the topics we've been doing, but I would like to discuss the topic of saving the life of a non-Jew on Shabbat, and the moral challenges that evokes. And then at the very end, I wanted to just summarize a couple of the principles that have emerged. And then if we have time to read two small passages, which are not on the source sheet, but which I'll put on the, if I could share my screen, if I have access to be able to share my screen, I would like to do that. So that's my goal tonight. So if we can put up the source sheet for tonight, when we talk about discussing the idea of Chilul Shabbat and saving the life of a Jew and a non-Jew. So this is the sheet from this is the first sheet.
Oh, whoops. Okay. Give me 1 second. I shall find the correct sheet. Apologies.
No problem.
And let me see.
Yeah. I sent it to Kayla on Sunday, so
yeah, you know what it is. I clicked on the wrong link in the spreadsheet.
Okay.
But I am right now opening the correct one.
Okay, thank you.
Oh. No, this seems to be the same one. Okay. I'm going to check.
I could get it from, directly from.
I'm just going to. She normally emails it to me as well, so I'm going to check the email. I've just made you able to share your screen. So
okay, I'll put it up myself, okay? And I'll share my screen. Okay?
Right. Sorry about that.
No problem. Okay. So I want to start with the whole question of, in general, the whole question of violating Shabbat in general. In every society, there are values that we are willing to give up our life for. And we're not necessarily we always say, even though we generally say life is most precious, we all understand that there are things in life that we are ready to sacrifice our lives for. Even in Jewish law today, we know that even when it comes to a Jew, there are things that you do not do. You can't murder someone. If you're forced to murder someone, you can't murder someone to save your life. So, at least a priori, irrespective of the question of a Jew or non-Jew, one could have theoretically said, maybe Shabbat is so important that you're never allowed to violate Shabbat, not only to save a non-Jew, but maybe not to save a Jew either. Again, it goes against the grain of what we know today, but that wasn't always the case. There's the famous case in the book of Maccabees. Since we're coming to Hanukkah, I thought it was good to start with that. The book of Maccabees discusses, the first book of Maccabees tells the story of a group of the Hasidim, a group of the pious ones who were fighting the Syrian Greeks. And it said many that sought after justice went down into the wilderness to dwell there, both they and their children, their wives, their cattle, because afflictions increased sore upon them. Now, when it was told to the king's servants, meaning the Greek king, and the host that was at Yerushalayim in the city of David, that certain men who had broken the king's commandments were gone down into the secret places, they pursued after them a great number, and having overtaken them, they camped against them and made war against them on the Sabbath day. And they said unto them, let that which you have done hereto suffice, come forth and do according to the canon, and you shall live. Basically, surrender. And they said, we will not come forth, neither will we do the king's commandments to profane the Sabbath day. We're not going to go worship Zeus. We're not going to violate the commandments, and we're not going to violate Shabbat. So then they gave them battle with speed. However, they answered not, neither cast the stone at them, nor stopped the places where they hid, but said, let us all die in our innocency. Heaven and earth will testify for us that you put us to death wrongfully. So they rose against them in battle, and they slew them with their wives and the children. So basically, these people were very pious. They were Hasidim, but they were pious to the extent that they paskined that you cannot fight war on Shabbat, and you have to be willing to keep the Sabbath under all circumstances. Now, when Matityahu and his friends understood hereof, they mourned for them right sore. And one of them said to another, if we all do as our brethren have done, and fight not for our lives in law against the heathen, they will now quickly root us out of the earth. At that time, therefore, they decreed, saying, whoever shall come to make battle with us on the Sabbath day, we will fight against him. Neither will we die all as our brethren that were murdered in the secret places. So you see that there was a tension in the original halakha. There was a tension in the original halakha about, there was a tension in the original halakha about, about whether the Sabbath is so important that you never violate it, even to save Jewish life. Eventually, of course, the view of Matityahu and his company won out. And even if originally the halakha may have been very stringent, eventually, one second, I just want to tell my son that I'm, okay. Eventually, the halakha went in a different direction and said that the Sabbath, as important as it is, you can violate the Sabbath. And that we find in Tannaitic sources. Amar Rav Yosef, for example, the Tosefta in Shabbat, Mishnah Yud Gimel. Amar Rav Yosef, minayin lepikuach nefesh dochet Shabbat. How do I know that you have to be dochet Shabbat? Shenemar. How do we know that it pushes off the Sabbath? Shenemar et Shabtotai tishmoru. You're supposed to keep the Sabbath. Yachol b'mila v'avoda pikuach nefesh. Tamalomar ach. Pamim shata shovet, pamim shiata shovet. There are times when you do keep the Sabbath, and there are times when you don't. So, for example, Brit Milah, you violate the Sabbath. You do a Brit Milah on the 8th day. Avodah, when it comes to the worship in the temple, they offered sacrifices in the temple. And Pikuach Nefesh, and pikuach nefesh, when it comes to saving a life. And therefore, you push aside to saving a life. And even if it's a suffix, even if it's a doubt. And another source says explicitly, we say explicitly, the Gemara says, and this is one of the famous sources, we say that Dinu sheyitchu et Shabbat lachyot nefesh besafek. Halo nitnu mitzvot Yisrael lichyot behem. It's a halakha that you push aside the Sabbath, even if it's a suffix, even if it's only a doubt. You're not sure you're going to save the life. You have to push off the Sabbath. Halo nitnu mitzvot Yisrael el lichyot behem. The purpose of the mitzvot is to live. Shenamar asher yaaseh otah ha'adam v'chai bahem, where it says that you're supposed to do the mitzvot and live. V'chai bahem v'lo shi'amut lachem, v'no shi'amut bahem, and not to die. Ein lecha davar omeid bifnei pikuach nefesh. There is nothing that stands in the way of saving a life, except chutz mi'avodah zara, idolatry, gilui arayot, certain sexual prohibitions, and shvichut damim. And shvichut damim, which of course is the concept of not murdering somebody. Okay. Now, yeah. Okay. Now, in the context of this, so I brought simply, I didn't want to reinvent the wheel. Rabbi Dov Linzer has a nice series on Halakha and modernity, and he has a discussion there about some of the distinctions between Jews and non-Jews, and he has a nice, kind of summary of some of the discussion. Torah states, "You shall not stand against the blood of your neighbor." A verse understood by the rabbis to mean that one may not stand idly by when another person is in danger. The verse uses the word re'echa, lo tamod al dam re'echa. And we would, and we will thus not be surprised to find that the mandate to preserve a life is generally understood to be limited to the life of a Jew. That's in terms of an obligation, but you certainly can do it. In some ways, this is less disturbing than the discussion above regarding the prohibition of murder. Here we are talking about passive non-assistance. We're not helping someone whose life is in danger, would be seen as immoral. Almost no secular legal system actually requires a person to come to the assistance of another person who is in danger. In America, there is no legal obligation to jump into or in England or anywhere else, to jump into a river and help someone who's drowning. It's the moral thing to do. It's an important thing to do, but it's not obligatory. And so the fact that one could theoretically say it's not obligatory except to those who are within your circle of family, your b'nai brit, your covenantal family, is something that could at least be justified. The purpose of Good Samaritan laws are to free a person who chooses to come to another's aid from any possible liability. However, this is because secular legalism focuses on rights and obligations. We would still expect a religious and moral system to require it regardless of the identity of the victim. Okay. Okay, now I want to move to okay. In line with the discussion above, it will not be surprising to find that the Talmud assumes that one may not save the life of a Gentile on Shabbat. If in general such action is seen as ill-advised, how much more so one would not be allowed to violate the Shabbat to render such a service. And this is, I just want to point out, this is also aggravated by another source for the mitzvah of violating Shabbat to save a life. We saw before that the basic source is Asher Yaseh Otam Ha'adam V'chai Bahem, that a person should live and not die by them, which is interpreted that therefore you violate Shabbat. There's another source that the Talmud quotes, which is very unique to Shabbat. The Gemara says, Et Shabtotai Tishmoru. So the Gemara says, Chalel alav Shabbat achat, Kedei sheyishmeru Shabbatot harbeh. A person should violate one Sabbath in order that you'll be able to keep many, many, many Sabbaths in the future. Now, this person will be able to keep. That argument is purely a parochial, particularistic argument. That line of thinking seems to be unique to those who are in the category of Sabbath observers. And if you only had that source, you certainly would not include non-Jews who are not saving the non-Jew. He's not going to keep Shabbos in the future. So that just aggravates the issue. And it's pretty clear from the Talmud that the Talmud did not clearly assume that you did not save the life of a Gentile on Shabbat. The whole idea of pushing off Shabbat was a chiddush, was something very unique, something supererogatory, something that you can only do because Sabbath is so important, but there's such an important mitzvah, either because we want them to keep Shabbat in the future or because v'chai bahem v'lo shiamut bahem. You're supposed to keep the mitzvot, but not die by the mitzvot. So nobody should be keeping the Sabbath. Again, it seems to focus on the particularistic Jewish perspective. And that's exactly what you find in this Talmudic passage in the Mishnah and Yoma. The Mishnah and Yoma says, Kol safek nefashot, dochet haShabbat. Whenever there's a doubt, you always push off the Sabbath. For example, Misha nafla lav mapolet. If a building collapsed on someone, safek hu sham, safek eino sham. You're not sure. Is he there or did he get out? Safek chai, safek mate. You're not sure. Is he alive? Is he dead? Safek nochri, safek Yisrael. You're not sure. Is it a non-Jew or a Jew? Mifakhin alav etagal. You go and you violate the Sabbath and take away the rubble. Matzu chai, if you find him alive, you continue mifakhin. The imate, and if you find him dead, yanichu, because at that point, it's not pikuach nefesh anymore. You leave him, and then after the Sabbath, you take the rubble away and bury the body. Implicit in this Mishnaic statement, which on the one hand is very, very liberal, in the sense that it says that you must, even if it's a suffix, even if it's a doubt, whether the guy's alive or not alive, you have to go and be mechalel Shabbat. You have to violate the Sabbath. However, one of the sfekot, one of the doubts is safek nachri, safek Yisrael. The implication was that if it was a vadai nachri, if it was definitely a non-Jew, you would not violate the Sabbath. That is the strict halakha from the perspective of the Talmud. And in fact, when Rabbi Ovadia Yosef was born, when Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, maybe we should put your sheet on now because it's easier to manipulate. I'm going to get off the sharing.
Yeah, for sure.
Thanks. Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, in a very famous comment that got him into big, big trouble, as many of his comments did, even though he was such a great posek in many other ways. So Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, thank you. You can go down, go down, go down, go down. Keep going down, keep going down. So Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, yeah. So did it come out? What happened? Why don't
okay. It seems like it got cut off.
I got cut off. Okay. So you can figure it out from the context. He says very clearly, he says, religious physicians cannot violate the Sabbath to save Gentiles' lives. He says, yeah, oh, no, I don't know. I don't know why it didn't come. Okay. And basically that, that you might be allowed to violate the derabbanans, you might be allowed to violate the rabbinic laws, but you can't violate the biblical laws. And this is based on a straight reading. If we come down, it's based on a straight reading of the Mishnah Brura. If we go down, keep going down, keep going down. Okay, Mishnah Brura, if you take it at face value, Mishnah Brura says that explicitly. The Chafetz Chaim in Siman Shin Lamed talks about as follows. On Chol, on a weekday, if you're getting paid to deliver a non-Jewish woman, then it's okay because you don't want to bring hatred to the Jewish community. The Isser applies on Shabbat. Only help those who keep Shabbat give birth on Shabbat. This can be used as an excuse, even if the act requested wouldn't violate. Almost all doctors today, even the more religious ones, are Sabbath desecrators. Every Shabbat, doctor drives long distances to heal Nochrim. He writes prescriptions and grinds medicine with no halachic basis on which to rely. Even if one suggests that the concern for Ava permits the transgression of a rabbinic prohibition, everyone agrees there's certainly no basis for leniency with regard to a Torah prohibition. So the Mishnah Brura is very, very stringent and says you would only be allowed to violate rabbinic prohibitions because what's called Ava. Ava is the idea that if you don't do it, it will cause great harm to the Jewish people. It will cause harm to Jews. There'll be pogroms. There'll be anti-Semitism. There'll be hate directed to Jews. So Rav Ovadia Yosef, quoting this Mishnah Brura, takes the view that that only allows you to violate rabbinic laws, but you cannot violate biblical laws for that reason. If you keep going down, Rabbi Dov Carroll cites a different point of view, which has tremendous ramifications. Some authorities, like we just said, the Mishnah Brura says Mishum Ava, because of Ava, because of concern for anti-Semitism and hate directed to the Jewish community, you would be allowed to violate rabbinic law. There were some poskim who went even further, like the Chatam Sofer and Rav Moshe Feinstein, who took the view that Mishum Ava, because of concern for anti-Semitism and the fallout, that you would be allowed to do even biblical prohibitions. Mishum Ava is so strong, the concern that it might put other people in danger, other Jews in danger, that it wipes away in the context of this thing, and especially in our society where everything is videotaped and everything is on an iPhone and everything is reported, it certainly would cause great enmity. But there's a more principled point of view. Rabbi Dov Carroll, some authorities take a more principled approach to making this allowance, saving a Gentile's life in contemporary society, regardless of concern for the deleterious results of not saving a Gentile life. The mechanism for this approach is to limit the Gemara's ruling to Gentiles of the type that were common in the society of Talmudic times. Idolaters, claiming that it is not applicable to Gentiles in our society. Now, this can be done in a number of ways. One way that is very famous is through the far-reaching systematic perspective of the Meiri that many have written about. Menachem Meiri, who was a Provençal scholar in the mid-1200s, a Maimonidean, in a certain sense, a Maimonidean. He took the view that all of the discriminatory laws in the Talmud against Gentiles were only said in the context of pagans who had, basically who were, as he said, were people who there was no reciprocity. They would be willing to kill you, and they behaved in ways that were uncivilized, etc. But he says, Umot HaGedurot, nations, for example, the people that he encountered, civilized nations that have a basic moral code based on monotheism, were never under the rubric of the Talmudic laws that are very harsh and distinguishing between Jews and non-Jews. That's one approach, which is extremely broad and basically wipes away the category of any of these distinctions in general. Professor Moshe Halbertal has written a book about the Meiri, and he has a whole chapter about it. Professor David Berger has written about it. Many scholars have written about this Meiri. The bottom line is it's very far-reaching. In the Middle Ages, it wasn't necessarily the dominant view. Most Jews considered Christians that they encountered Ovdei Avodah Zarah. They did not take the view that they were not pagans. Most Jews took the view that Christianity was idolatry and the Christian should be treated that way. Meiri basically wiped away that entire category. Again, I'm not talking about the fact that that would then allow Jews to become Christians. That's not true. Jews have to keep Judaism. But the idea of the category of the Christian as being different, the medieval Christian, even with all the anti-Semitism and even with all that, was still a big chiddush. But it was not necessarily adopted by all. There's a second category, and that's what Rabbi Carroll is speaking about here. The mechanism for this approach is to limit the Gemara's ruling to Gentiles of the type that were common in the society of Talmudic times, idolaters, claiming that it is not applicable to Gentiles in our sight. One source cited as a basis for this view is the Ramban, who counts helping and saving a ger toshav, a Gentile who has accepted the 7 Noahide laws, including violating Shabbat to save his life, as a mitzvah. If one takes the position of the Ramban, and Rav Aaron Soloveitchik points out that there are others who take this view as well, the question then remains whether contemporary Gentiles are defined as ger toshav. Rabbi Soloveitchik is quoted by some of his students as explicitly citing this as his basic source. And others, Rav Kook and others, were very fond of quoting this. The Ramban says this, if we go down a little bit. Nachmanides says as follows: Shenitztavinu lachayot ger toshav. There is a mitzvah to ensure that the ger toshav, the resident alien who agrees to live in the land of Israel under Jewish rule, and that he agrees to keep the 7 Noahide laws, lahatzilo meira'ato. There's an obligation to save him. She'im haya nitba b'nahar nafal av hagal shenitrach b'chol kochenu, that if he was under a pile of rubble, that we would work to save him. V'im haya choleh nitasek b'refuato. We would definitely work to save him. V'kol shekain me'achenu Yisrael oger tzedek, and certainly one of our brethren or a convert, shanu mechuyavim lo b'chol eileh. And this would be included under the rubric of pikuach nefesh, which pushes aside the laws of Shabbat. And so, from this perspective, if you believe that most Gentiles in the world today could be under that status because they basically accept some form of the Noahide code of not to murder and not to steal as the basic ethical, moral yardstick, then one could theoretically say all Gentiles are under this category. If we continue a little bit down, there's a famous essay written by Dr. David Berger in one of the Orthodox Forum volumes, where Dr. Berger says this explicitly: perhaps modern-day Gentiles are all considered ger toshav. Or perhaps the law against saving lives of non-Jews only applies to pagans who practice quintessential idolatry. Rabbi Yechiel of Paris held this view. There are a lot of positive laws against Gentiles, and the laws against non-Jews only apply to the 7 nations of Canaan. Jews nowadays do a lot of business with Christians that, if they were considered Gentiles, would not be allowed. Why then did the letter fall short of the ultimate will of the lawgiver? So Dr. Berger wants to posit a suggestion. Why is it that the technical law as it was founded didn't always explicitly indicate that today, and certainly, that Gentiles should be saved? Arguably, God wanted to give a people that he knew would be persecuted, beleaguered, some leeway to respond to their oppressors in less than ideal fashion when circumstances generally demanded this. Perhaps he needed to reinforce a sense of special standing so that a positive Jewish self-image would be sufficiently strong to withstand the deflation of exile, subordination, and suffering. If we can go down a little bit. Perhaps he wanted to provide us with the test of developing a moral character in the absence of rigid commands. So basically, Dr. Berger is arguing here that what by the Torah not explicitly formulating exactly who these discriminatory laws apply to, the Torah wants, on the one hand, to leave wiggle room, that in societies in which the Gentiles act without any reciprocity of civil behavior to the Jewish people, that there would be room for a healthy sense of Jewish self-awareness and protection of the Jewish polity. And in other situations, when there was reciprocity and there was a sense of unity in mankind and moral concern for every person, that Jewish people would act accordingly as well and develop their moral character. So if we continue down, okay, we see that there is also another principle that is thrown about. So far we've seen kind of three principles that kind of limit the application and make this a kind of dead letter law. Number one is Mishum Eva, because of harm that may come to Jews if they don't save the life of a non-Jew on Shabbat. In the Mishnah Brura's reading, that only allows for the violation of rabbinic law, so you have to try to find a way of only limiting it to rabbinic law. The Chatam Sofer and Rav Moshe were willing to say that that even allows for the violation of biblical laws. We have the second approach, which is the Meiri, which basically wipes away the concept of and says that almost all of these discriminatory laws was only said in the context of real pagans who acted in ways that were uncivilized and barbaric, and not pagans, and not with non-Jews who have a moral code like the seven of not murder and not stealing, etc. We had the kind of so to speak, a nuance of that, the concept of a ger toshav. The ger toshav is a kind of resident alien, and that maybe most non-Jews in the world today fit under that category, that they have a basic commitment to the Zion mitzvot b'nei Noach, the 7 Noahide laws that are well known in society. There is a fourth or fifth. What did I say so far? One, two, three concept. This is 4, and this is the concept of darkei shalom, which is different than mipnei eva. The Mishnah in Gittin says the following: Elu dvarim amru mipnei darkei shalom. These are the things that were adjudicated by and legislated by the rabbis because of ways of peace. And the examples, there's a whole list of examples here. The last example is umachzikin yedei goyim b'shvi'it. And you, on the sabbatical years, you also are supposed to make sure that the non-Jewish poor are taken care of. The same thing in if you look up 2 lines before, Ein memachin biyedei aniyei goyim beleket shikcha peah mipnei darkei shalom. You don't stop the non-Jewish poor from taking the leket shikcha peah, from taking the what you leave over, the farmer, the Jewish farmer is supposed to leave over a corner of his field, and he's supposed to leave over the things that fall when he's collecting. He's supposed to leave all those things because of ways of peace. Now, what does ways of peace mean in this context? It sounds like you don't want to cause enmity, but it's more than that. If we keep going down, we'll notice, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. Stop. Okay. Keep going, keep going. We want to skip this. Keep going. I want to go to the Rambam. Yeah, Maimonides. Keep going. Sorry, keep going. Sorry, I shouldn't have copied all this. Keep going, keep going, keep going. Sorry. Okay. No, it's not. Go back now. Okay. Back. One second. I thought I printed a Rambam here, but okay. So keep going back. I'm sorry. I thought it was okay. Stop. So the Tosefta says, Ir sheyesh ba Yisrael v'goyim, a city that has both Jews and non-Jews. Haparnasim govim Yisrael umigoyim darkei shalom. You're supposed to collect tzedakah from both Jews and non-Jews. Umefarnasin aniyei goyim anisom darkei shalom. And you are supposed to provide for the non-Jewish poor, even probably if you only collect it from the Jews. Jews are supposed to provide also because of ways of peace. Continues the Tosefta, Maspidim v'kovrim meitei goyim darkei shalom. You bury the non-Jewish dead because of darkei shalom. You go and do nichum avelim. You go and visit people and comfort the mourners because of darkei shalom. Continue. Let's go down. Go down now. Let's read a little bit in the English. Okay. For the Tosefta, darkei shalom is not limited to not doing acts that will cause conflict or simple verbal well-wishing. It mandates acts that require a serious investment of time and money, and whose goals are to promote positive feeling and a sense of community. The requirement to collect charity from them is particularly significant. It is not to offset the cost of giving them. It is an act that itself promotes peace. Recognizing someone as a contributing member of one, this is from Rabbi Linzer's essay, as a contributing member of one society, someone who gives, not just who takes, creates a profound sense of membership and community, and breaks down a we-them dichotomy in ways that could not be accomplished by merely giving them financial support. The same holds true regarding the obligation to participate in their funerals, to comfort the mourners, visit the sick. These acts create a strong sense of emotional connection, of feeling their loss, and of identifying empathy. In other words, it serves to lower the divisions between the groups and to create a more interconnected community. Gentiles are not part of our narrowly defined community, but if we are living among them, a town that has both Jews and Gentiles, they are part of our larger community. Okay. Now, if you continue, go down now, go down. So Suzanne Stone, who was a professor of law, speaks about this and points it out that it is not just about reciprocity. I want to read the English a little bit, go down. By adroitly reversing the normal direction of the equation, Professor Stone turns the principle of self-interest in one of moral behavior. Instead of saying we are nice to them so that they will be nice to us, we say we are nice to them because they have been nice to us. It becomes a principle of gratitude and reciprocity. Well, these ethical issues also operate on the individual, interpersonal level, rendering acts of kindness and expressions of gratitude to those who have given us concrete benefit. Professor Stone is thinking here in more global and abstract terms. If we see ourselves as member of the larger human society, then we will understand our debt to society and relation to help and support its members and its well-being. So again, this is the idea. Now, if you keep going down. So Rabbi Eliezer Melamed writes, again, he's one of the more popular poskim today in the religious Zionist world. He writes, the sages offered a rationale for desecrating the Sabbath to save someone's life. Desecrate one's Shabbat so that he will observe many Shabbatot. However, in practice, even when it is clear that the person being saved will not observe Shabbat, one is commanded to desecrate Shabbat to save him, because the Torah strives to increase life. Therefore, we desecrate Shabbat to save a mentally impaired person who is exempt from observing the mitzvot. Similarly, we desecrate Shabbat for someone who is unconscious and about to die in order to prolong his life. We desecrate Shabbat in order to save an unborn fetus, even if 40 days have not yet passed since conception. Similarly, we desecrate Shabbat to save a premature baby. Although in the past it was forbidden to desecrate Shabbat to save a baby born in the 8th month, as it was certain that it would not survive. Nowadays, with the improvement of medicine and the invention of the incubator, wherever doctors assess that the baby has a chance to long, we desecrate Shabbat. Technically, a Jew may not desecrate Shabbat to save a non-Jew, since one may only desecrate Shabbat for the sake of someone who is himself commanded to keep Shabbat. However, in practice, this rule only applies when another non-Jew is present to save his fellow non-Jew. If no other non-Jew is present, one must treat the non-Jew, even if this requires desecrating Shabbat. Since we want non-Jews to save Jews, we must save them as well. The saving a life is included in the category of pikuach nefesh. And he cites all the halachic material. If you look in footnote number 2, the Chatam Sofer, Rav Moshe Feinstein, and everything that we have mentioned. Keep going. I think that's about, yeah. So basically, in terms of practical halakha, all of this today is a kind of dead letter law. Everyone, any doctor, any observant doctor treats everybody in every hospital on Shabbat, Doraita, Durabanan. And again, now if one had a more mystical conception of the ongoing revelation of God in history, or the ongoing revelation of development of halakha, one could say, oh, you see that this is the unfolding of the halakha in such a way that it lives up to the highest moral, ethical principles. If you look in Maimonides, for example, when he talks about mefarnesin aniei akum, that we take care of the poor, of the non-Jewish poor, together with the Jewish poor, he says as follows. He says, Mipnei darkei shalom, but he doesn't stop there. Maimonides continues and says, V'ne'emar, and it says, Tov Adonai lakol, v'rachamav al kol ma'asav. God is good to all, and he is merciful to everyone. V'ne'emar, dirachea darchei noam, v'chol netivotea shalom. And God, the Torah's ways are ways of peace. So Maimonides clearly seems to be pushing the concept of darkei shalom and dirachei darchei noam beyond a very reciprocal and purely instrumental, but much more about we are supposed to be imitating God. And if God is rachamav al kol ma'asav, so too we should be doing that as well. So it pushes it in a much more what we would call value conception of what we're supposed to be doing. And again, on the ground, Lamaisa, people certainly, that's what happens. Okay. With that, we close our discussion of specific topics. We looked at Amalek, we looked at Ir Hanidachat, the city that was right. We looked at the Eshet Yefat Toar. We looked at smiting the Egyptian. We looked at many different topics, and we saw different models of how to address these kinds of questions. We talked about halakha as a floor, not a ceiling, that you're supposed to aspire for greater behavior. We talked about the fact that the rabbis sometimes engaged in very creative exegesis, parshanut, in order to interpret texts and limit the situation, to limit some of the conflict. We talked about the fact that sometimes the rabbis used meta principles, like, for example, when we did the Ir Hanidachat, And we saw that some of the Rishonim said, you can't paskin that you kill the children because chalila la'el me'asot kadavar hazeh. It's chalila that this should be the way we paskin because it's impossible that God would engage in such thing. Or we saw in Amalek, we saw the tshuva of the Avnei Nezer, where he talks about God, you can't hold, 10 generations later responsible. It says, Lo yumtu avot al banim. It flies in the face of other moral principles in the Torah. So it must be that we reinterpret it's only Amalek if they continue to act in an Amalekite fashion. But if they don't, then you don't have an obligation. So we saw, as I said, we saw creative exegesis. We saw the use of certain meta-halachic principles. We saw the attempt to minimize the conflict as much as possible, and etc. So I just wanted to close with two interesting passages, and which kind of lays out. And again, I just want to say, for the record, some, not all, but some of the debates that we continue to have within orthodoxy about how do we deal with certain problematic halachot, and are there ways that we can nibble at solutions? Some of it is rooted in these debates about how far do our moral qualms, intuitions affect how we interpret the halakha? What tools are we willing to bring forth? How far are we willing to go, et cetera, et cetera? And so, it plays itself out practically on the ground in many issues. So I would like to close with two passages. One is from, and here, let me share my screen again. If I can share my screen. So one passage is from an essay by Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, Zichron Livracha, called Halachot v'Halachim al Oshiyut HaMusar, which is a fancy word for Halachot v'Halachim, Halachot, Halakha, and how one acts. Al Oshiyut, the sources of ethics. And this is my translation. So Rabbi Lichtenstein, again, writes here, and again, I think this is the attitude that we should all have. The parameters of ethics and morality and its truths have an important role to play in understanding halakha and defining its boundaries. Again, this is a very important formulation, that we don't say that the posek comes to the table as a kind of tabula rasa, and he just inputs data and ping comes out an answer. The parameters of ethics and its truths have an important role to play in understanding and defining its boundaries. Of course, a Jew must be ready to answer the call, hineni, if the command to offer him up is thrust upon him. Meaning the Akedah teaches that at first blush, a person has to be ready to offer everything to God, even if it goes against his natural moral inclination. However, prior to unsheathing the sword, he is permitted and even obligated to clarify to the best of his ability if indeed this is what actually has been commanded. So the first goal is to try to minimize the conflict. Can you minimize the conflict as much as possible? Can you limit the areas of conflict? No, Amalek isn't always, and even in the individual, it's only for the tzibur. It's only for the community. And even when it's for the community, it doesn't apply to people who don't act. Right? That's an attempt to use the moral values within the Torah and other ethical statements in the Torah to lime the parameters of what you're doing. Is the command so clear-cut? And is the collision of values indeed so frontal and unavoidable? To the extent that there is a need and room for halachic exegesis, and this must be clarified, a sensitive and insightful conscience is one of the factors that shape the decision-making process. So again, Rav Aaron here makes it very clear that the sources, one's moral intuitions can and should play a role. Just as and here he makes a fascinating analogy, just as Maimonides in his day consciously was assisted by a particular metaphysical approach to the world, Aristotelian thought, in order to plumb the depths of the meaning of biblical verses, meaning Rambam reread major parts of the Torah in light of his assumptions about the truth of Aristotelian physics and metaphysics. So too, one can make use of an ethical perspective in order to understand the content of halakha and to outline its parameters. Clearly, this process requires extreme care and responsibility. Must be assured that, and this rooted in deep connection to authentic Torah and religious piety, one is attempting to understand halakha and not, God forbid, to distort it. And finally, I would like to read with you a radical passage from Rav Kook. So let me find that passage. Rav Kook, when he was young, wrote a book that was only published about 70 years after he died, because it was in a manuscript and they only published it much later. It was one of the early works of Rav Kook, and it's called L'Nevuchei Hador, which is a play on the Moreh HaNevuchim, the guide for the perplexed. So to the perplexed of the generation. It's one of Rav Kook's first initial attempts at laying out his vision. This is before he made Aliyah. So there's still some ideas that are inchoate. But listen to what he writes about what could happen. And this is a vision of the future, which is amazing. So Rav Kook writes as follows in chapter 13. He says, the foundation of the oral Torah is spoken about explicitly in the written Torah, that anything that is too difficult to decide whether a simile should be done only according to the verdict that they have announced to us from the place that God chooses. They refers here to the Sanhedrin, to the high court in Jerusalem. See, the difficulty can be cut in many ways, for there are many facets to doubt. But all doubts in the world must be decided only by the great din. The oral law like this makes sense, because that is beatitude and vitality of the nation. And now he says, there is nothing that limits the power of the great Beit Din to act and to make amendments for the sake of heaven, according to all the needs of the generation and all the minute details of the commandments. Besides for the concept that the sages can say, Shev al tasa, allowing people to passively abstain from a positive, there is a law that gives the sages the power to uproot something from the Torah, even with an exhortation of kum va'aseh, that they must do something. Even though the conclusion of the Talmud is that the sages do not have the power to uproot something, nevertheless, the great Sanhedrin in the chamber of hewn stone, when they are set up properly, will not be chained to this detail. Behold, Rav Chizda as well as Meder held that the Beit Din does indeed have the power to uproot something from the Torah. And if the great Beit Din will decide like those Amoraim, they certainly have the ability to do that. For it makes no sense that they would be chained to the decision of the Talmud. There were also medieval authorities who sided with Rav Chizda, and when there is a need and proper reason, Tosot has written that they do have the ability to uproot something from the Torah. Moreover, if the great Beit Din brings proofs from their positions from Scripture by way of interpretation, then nothing is uprooted from the Torah at all. Specifically, we don't have a clear tradition regarding which specific details of Jewish law are laws from Sinai and which are decreed and expanded. And therefore, it continues. We see that certainly the great Beit Din has the power over all the details to amend and to innovate when there is a need. Anyone who rebels against them, whether to be more lenient or strict, he is transgression. To illustrate, it is a Tanidic argument whether we can determine the reason for Torah commandments. Darshinan taima dekra or not. Are you allowed to use your understanding of the rationale of a Torah law to delimit how far the law goes. If the great Beit Din establishes that the law is like the opinion that Beit Din can establish a reason, as well as to innovate many laws according to those reasons, they definitely have the ability. Anything that comes out by their approval is the complete Torah. Don't be concerned. The law, God forbid that the Torah be nullified, for all the ways of the Torah, pleasant ways and paths of peace. If Beit Din needs to innovate some details, they are certainly causing the framework of Torah to be strengthened, enriching our nation physically and spiritually. So Rav Kook here, stop, let me go back here. So Rav Kook here is laying out a very fascinating vision of the future, in which when the Sanhedrin is restored, the Sanhedrin has tremendous leeway to amend, change, limit, fix laws of the Torah with the powers that are invested in it, based on exegesis, interpretation, takana, all kinds of great power, which has tremendous ramifications. And that's one of the reasons Rav Kook, for example, worked so hard to create the chief rabbinate, because he saw it as a stepping stone that because he believed we were in messianic times, that eventually it could develop into the stepping stone for an eventual development of the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. And with that could come a revival of Jewish law in a way that could solve many of the dilemmas of the generation, solve many of the issues, not just technically. Oh, when the Sanhedrin comes, we'll be able to use medicine on Shabbos, because we'll throw away that, whatever it is. Or we'll get rid of Yom Tov Sheni Shel Galiot, as so many people want to do. And the hotels will be very upset because they can't charge people $800 for a meal, whatever, on the second day of Yom Tov when they go to Israel. But Rav Kook here is going further and saying that they have the power to totally rejigger, just as Chazal did, just as we learned about certain mitzvot that the rabbis, using the power of exegesis, limited, delimited, interpreted, made dead letter, all kinds of. I would assume that Rav Kook would also say, when it comes to these moral dilemmas, there are things besides what we've seen already, that there are the great power that the Sanhedrin hopes for. And so when we daven for the restoration, Hashiva Shovtenu Kivarishona V'yoatzenu Kivatchila, part of that is that. And I believe with all my heart that if a Sanhedrin would one day come, so much of Jewish law that is quote unquote problematic would cease being problematic. But what it also tells us is that even today, when we don't have a Sanhedrin, we certainly should be aware of all the mechanisms that have existed in the past, where the rabbis, the great rabbis of the past, in the tshuvot, in the responsa, and in their creative use within the limits, they didn't have the ultimate power of the Sanhedrin, but within the limits of post-Talmudic Judaism, they certainly allowed themselves, when they felt, again, as Rav Lichtenstein said, when a sensitive and ethical conscience helps define the limits and how far you're going to push and what are you going to look for and what kinds of kulot and what kinds of leniency. It's all going to be part of the equation. So even before Sanhedrin, the mindset is one that I think every serious, sensitive posek should have with them. So I thank everyone for their hakshava, for their listening, for their learning, for everyone being with us the last 7 weeks. I wish everybody a happy Hanukkah and enjoy Hanukkah with family if you're able to. And let's hear, as we said, when I was in Israel, the phrase is Besorot Tovot. We all are hoping for better news from Israel and in general and the world and the challenges we face. So all the best to everybody.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Helfgot, not just for this week, but for an amazing past 7 sessions of tackling some really fascinating but difficult topics. So thank you so much.
No problem.
Some quick announcements from Drisha before you all run off to your weeks. We have 2 new classes that have started in the last few weeks of our Fall Zman. Hanukkah, the holiday of homebodies, on Tuesday nights at 8 p.m. with Rabbinic Leah Sana, and Technologies of Transmission on Wednesday nights at 8 p.m. with Rabbinic Sarah Wolkenfeld. Our Winter Zman is starting up soon, and we're starting with a special short program on organ donation from December the 25th to the 27th, and we're continuing with Mishnah in depth, this time with Ketubot with Rabbinic Leah Sana. You can find out about all those classes and more at 5784.drisha.org/winter. So thank you, everybody, and wishing you a great week.